The Best of Ideas, Part 1. The 1966 Massey Lectures by Dr. Paul Goodman. I'm Ken Haslam, your host for The Best of Ideas from CBC Toronto. The Moral Ambiguity of America is the title of this year's series of 6 talks by Dr. Paul Goodman, the CBC's guest lecturer for 1966. Tonight, the renowned social critic, author, and teacher outlines the problems of overpopulation in North American cities and suggests possible alternatives: urbanization and rural reconstruction.
I started the last lecture by pointing out how the present style of technology is regarded as an independent cause of history. Even more so with urbanization. It is as if by a law of nature, the favorite metaphor is that the city is a magnet, that by 1990, 75% of the Americans will live in dense metropolitan areas. At present, only about 6% are listed as rural. The urbanization is not a necessary effect of the technology. Indeed, the thrust of modern technology, for example, electricity, power tools, automobiles, distant communication, and automation, would seem to be to a disurbanization, to a dispersal of population and industry. This was the thinking of Marx and Engels, Kropotkin, Patrick Geddes, Frank Lloyd Wright, and other enthusiasts of scientific technology. The urbanization is not a necessity of population growth. In fact, with the bankruptcy of small farming, vast, beautiful regions have been depopulating and sometimes returning to swamp. American growth is supposed to level off in 50 years at 300 million, not a crowded number, but such a big country. Yet the cities already show signs of overpopulation. They do not provide adequate city services and probably cannot provide them. They are vulnerable to urban catastrophes that might destroy thousands. It is prohibitively costly to live decently in them. And in my opinion, though this is hard to prove, the crowding is already more than is permissible for mental health and normal growing up. But it is as with the misuse of technology. The urbanization is mainly due not to natural or social psychological causes, but to political policy and an economic style careless of social costs and even money costs. Like the rest of our interlocking system, the American system of enclosure has been an intricate complex. National farm subsidies have favored big plantations, which work in various combinations with national chain grocers who now sell 70% of the food. 100 companies sell more than 50% of the food. Chains and processes merge. As rural regions depopulate, railroads discontinue service with the approval of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Rural schools are encouraged to degenerate, and land-grant colleges change their curricula toward urban occupations. The Army and Navy recruit apace among displaced farm boys, as they do also among city Negroes and Spanish Americans. All this is rationalized by saying, as usual, that it is efficient. One farmer can now feed 30 people. Yet strangely, though most of the farmers are gone and the take of the remaining farmers indeed tends to diminish every year, the price of food is not cheaper. It is about the same, barring inflation. The difference goes to the processors, packagers, transporters, and middlemen. These operate in the established style. That is, the urbanization and rural depopulation are not technical nor economic, but political. The remarkable increase in technical efficiency could just as well produce rural affluence or a cooperative society of farmers and consumers. Of course, the galloping urbanization has been worldwide, and it is most devastating in the so-called underdeveloped countries which cannot afford such blunders. Here the method of enclosure is more brutal. Typically, my country, or some other advanced nation, introduces a wildly inflationary standard. For example, a few jobs at $70 a week when the average cash income of a peon is $70 a year. If only to maintain their self-respect, the peasants flock to the city where there are no jobs for them. They settle around it in shanty towns and die of cholera. They used to be poor but dignified and fed. Now they are urbanized, degraded, and dead. In the United States, though we collect the refugees in slums, we do not permit them to die of starvation or cholera. But I am again bemused at the economics of the welfare procedure. Partly our urban troubles spring from no planning, partly from just the planning that there is. When concrete observation and sympathy for human convenience are called for, there is no forethought and we drift aimlessly. When there is planning, it is abstract and aimed at keeping things under control. There is a theory, as yet unproved, that planning can dispense with the concept home. It is a debased version of Le Corbusier's formula that a house is a machine for living, equal for any tenant, and therefore controlled to be interchangeable. But is it the case that people thrive without an owned place, unanalyzable because it is the matrix in which other functions occur, and is idiosyncratic? Maybe they can, maybe they can't. My point is not that the DU, the dwelling unit, is not so good as the shack in a white supremacist county down south. It is better. But that home in a shack, plus $1,000 a year to improve it, is much better even down south, where money talks as loud as elsewhere. Another term that has vanished from planning vocabulary is city. Instead, there are urban areas. There is no longer an art of city planning, but a science of urbanism, which analyzes and relates the various urban functions, taking into account priorities and allocating available finances. There is no architectonic principle of civic identification or community spirit which the planner shares as a citizen, and in terms of which he makes crucial decisions, including on economic choices. Such a principle of civic identification is perhaps unrealistic in a national culture, economy, and technology. We are citizens of the United States, not of New York City. But is it the case that urban areas, rather than cities, are governable? Every municipality deplores the lack of civic pride, for instance, in littering and vandalism, but it is a premise of its own planning that there should be no civic pride. Anomie is primarily giving up on the immediate public environment. The children are bitten by rats, so why bother? The river stinks, so why bother? This kind of depression can go as far as tuberculosis, not to speak of mental disease. In my opinion, it is particularly impossible for the young to grow up without a community or local patriotism, for the locality is their only real environment. In any case, when the going gets rough, which happens more and more frequently in American cities, poor people retreat into their neighborhood and cry, "It's ours," or they burn the neighborhood up because they are not citizens in their own place. The middle class, as usual, makes a more rational choice. Since the center offers neither home nor city nor an acceptable environment for their children, they leave it, avoiding its jurisdiction, taxes, and responsibilities, but staying near enough to exploit its jobs and services. It is painfully reminiscent of imperial Rome, the return of the farmland to swamp, and the flight of the optimati from the city center. The central city is occupied by a stinking mob who can hardly be called citizens, and the periphery by the knights and senators who are no longer interested in being citizens. This is an urban area. Moral defects are disastrous in the long run, but American cities are also vulnerable to more immediate dangers to life and limb. In my own city of New York, during the past year, we have been visited by 10 critical plagues, some of them temporary emergencies that could recur at any time, some abiding sores that are getting worse. It is interesting to list these and notice the responses of the New Yorkers to them. There was a power failure that for a few hours blacked out everything and brought most activity to a stop. There was a subway and bus strike that for a couple of weeks slowed down everything and disrupted everybody's business. There was a threatened water shortage persisting for a year, and which, if the supply had really failed, would probably have made the city unlivable. In these objective emergencies, the New Yorkers responded with fine citizenship, good humor, and mutual aid. By and large, they remember the emergencies as better than business as usual. Everybody was in the same boat. The rivers and bays are polluted and often stink. In a huge city with no open space and few facilities for recreation, this is a calamity. The air is bad but not critical, so I will not include it. The congestion is critical. Traffic often hardly moves, and new highways will only make the situation worse. There is no solution but to ban private cars, but no politician has the nerve to do it. As for human crowding, it is hard to know at what density people can no longer adapt. But there must be a point at which there are too many signals and the circuits become clogged, and where people do not have enough social space to feel self-possessed. In some areas, in my opinion, we have passed that point. In Harlem, there are 67,000 to the square mile. People live 2 and 3 to a room, and the average child of 12 will not have been half a mile from home. Toward these abiding ills, the attitude of New Yorkers is characteristically confused. They overwhelmingly and surprisingly vote $1 billion to clean up the pollution. They cooperate without grumbling with every gimmick to speed up traffic, although taxi drivers tell me that most of them are a lot of nonsense. They are willing to pay bigger bills than anywhere else for public housing and schools. As people, they are decent, but they are entirely lacking in determination to prevent the causes and to solve the conditions. They do not believe that anything will be done, and they accept this state of things. As citizens, they are washouts. Finally, there are the plagues that indicate breakdown, psychopathology, and sociopathology. There are estimated 70,000 dope addicts, with the attendant desperate petty burglary. The juvenile delinquency starts like urban juvenile delinquency of the past, but it persists into addiction or other social withdrawal because there is less neighborhood support and less economic opportunity. Families have now grown up for several generations dependent on relief, reformatories, public hospitals, and asylums as the normal course of life. A psychiatric survey of Midtown Manhattan has shown that 75% have marked neurotic symptoms and 25% need psychiatric treatment, which is of course unavailable. Given the stress of such actual physical and psychological dangers, we can no longer speak in urban sociology merely of urban loneliness, alienation, mechanization, delinquency, class and racial tensions, and so forth. Anomie is one thing. Fearing for one's life and sanity is another. On the present scale, urbanization is a unique phenomenon, and we must expect new consequences. To put it another way, it becomes increasingly difficult for candid observers to distinguish between populist protest, youth alienation, delinquency, mental disease, civil disobedience, and outright riot. All sometimes seem to be equally political. At other times, all seem to be merely symptomatic. Inevitably, the cities are in financial straits. At a recent Senate hearing, Mayor Lindsay of New York explained that to make the city livable, as he said, would require $50 billion more in the next 10 years over and above the normal revenue. Since the cities are not ecologically viable, the costs for services, transportation, housing, schooling, welfare, and policing steadily mount with diminishing benefits. Meantime, the blighted central city provides less revenue. The new middle class, as we have seen, pays its taxes in suburban counties, and in the state legislatures, the rural counties, which are overrepresented because of the drastic shift in population, are stingy about paying for specifically urban needs, which are indeed out of line in cost. Radical liberals believe, of course, that all troubles can be immensely helped if urban areas get much more money from national and state governments. And they set store by the reapportionment of the state legislatures as ordered by the Supreme Court. But in my opinion, if the money is spent for the usual liberal social engineering, for more freeways, bureaucratic welfare and schooling, bulldozing urban renewal, subsidized suburbanization, and police, it will not only fail to solve the problems, but will aggravate them. It will increase the anomie and the crowding. The basic error is to take the present urbanization for granted, both in style and extent, rather than to rethink it. To alleviate anomie, we must, however inefficient and hard to administer it may be, avoid the present massification and social engineering. We must experiment with new forms of democracy so that the urban areas can become cities again and the people citizens. I shall return to this subject in the following lectures. But to relieve the absolute overcrowding that has already occurred or is imminent, nothing else will do but a certain amount of dispersal, which is unlikely in this generation in the United States. It involves rural reconstruction and the building up of the country towns that are their regional capitals. Liberals, when they think about urbanization, either disregard the country or treat it as an enemy in the legislature. A result of such a policy is to aggravate still another American headache, depressed rural areas. The few quixotic friends of rural reconstruction, on the other hand, like Ralph Borsodi and the people of the Green Revolution, cut loose from urban problems altogether as from a sinking ship. But this is morally unrealistic, since in fact serious people cannot dissociate themselves from the main problems of society. They would regard themselves as deeply useless, just as small farmers do consider themselves. A possible basis of rural reconstruction, however, is for the country to help with urban problems, where it can more cheaply and far more effectively, and thus to become socially important again. An heroic example is how the Israeli kibbutzim handled the influx of the hundreds of thousands of Oriental Jews who came destitute and alien. Radicals, what I have called the wave of urban populists, the students, Negroes, radical professors, and just irate citizens, are on this subject no better than the liberals. They are busy and inventive about new forms of urban democracy, but they are sure to call the use of the country and rural reconstruction reactionary. Typically, if I suggest to a Harlem leader that some of the children might do better boarding with a farmer and going to a village school, somewhat like children of the upper middle class, I am told that I am downgrading Negroes by consigning them to the sticks. It is a curious reversal of the narrowness of the agrarian populism of 80 years ago. At that time, the farmers lost out by failing to ally themselves with city industrial workers who were regarded as immoral foreigners and coolie labor. Now farmers are regarded as backward fools, like one's sharecropper father. Although the urban areas are patently unlivable, they have narrowed their inhabitants' experience so that no other choice seems available to them. In Canada, a more rational judgment is possible. You have a rural ratio, 15 to 20%, including independent fishermen, lumberers, etc., that we ought to envy. Your cities, though in need of improvement, are manageable in size. There is still a nodding acquaintance between city and country. I urge you not to proceed down our primrose path, but to keep the ratio you have, and as your technology and population grow, to work out a better urban-rural symbiosis. Traditionally in the United States, farming as a way of life and the maintenance of a high rural ratio have been regarded as the source of all moral virtue and political independence. But by and large, public policy has tended to destroy them. The last important attempt to increase small farming was during the Great Depression, when subsistence farms were subsidized as a social stabilizer, preferable to shanties in the park and breadlines. The program lapsed with the war production prosperity that we still enjoy, and for 20 years, as we have seen, public policy has conspired to liquidate rural life completely. There were no Jeffersonian protests when President Johnson declared 2 years ago that it is his intention to get 2 million more families off the land. Nevertheless, in the present emergency of excessive urbanization, let me offer 4 or 5 ideas for rural reconstruction. 1. At once reassign to the country urban services that can be better performed there, especially to depopulating areas to preserve what there is. And do not do this by setting up new urban-run institutions in the country, but using local families, facilities, and institutions administered by the now underemployed county agents, farmers' union, 4-H clubs, and town governments. Consider a few examples. For a slum child who has never been half a mile from home, a couple of years boarding with a farm family and attending a country school is what anthropologists call a culture shock, opening wide the mind. The cost per child in a New York grade school is $850 a year. Let us divide this sum equally between farmer and local school. Then for 3 boarders, the farmer gets $30 a week. He must merely feed them and not beat them, and add on some of the children's welfare money, leaving some for the mothers in the city. With a dozen children, $5,000, the underused school can buy a new teacher or splendid new equipment. Add on the school lunch subsidy. $2,500 a year of welfare money in New York City or Chicago buys a family destitution and undernourishment. In beautiful depopulating areas of Vermont, Maine, or Upper New York State, or southern Iowa and northern Wisconsin, it is sufficient for a decent life and even owning a house and land. Indeed, if we had a reasonable world, the same sum would make a family quite well-to-do in parts of Mexico, Greece, or even Ireland. Here is a more touchy example. The great majority of inmates in our vast public mental institutions are harmless themselves, but in danger on the city streets. Many, perhaps most, rot away without treatment. A certain number would be better off, and there would be more remissions, if they roamed remote villages and the countryside as the local eccentrics or loonies, and if they lived in small nursing homes or with farm families who were paid well to fetch them home. I understand that this system worked pretty well in Holland. 2. Most proposals like these, however, require changes in jurisdiction and administrative purpose. A metropolitan school board will not give up a slum child, though the cost is the same and the classrooms are crowded. No municipality will pay welfare money to a non-resident to spend elsewhere. I do not know the attitude in this respect of frantically overworked mental hospitals, which do try to get the patients out. Besides, often in the American federal system, one cannot cross state lines. A New York child would not get state education aid in Vermont, for instance. So, in conditions of excessive urbanization, let us define a region symbiotically rather than economically or technologically. It is the urban area and the surrounding country with a contrasting way of life and different conditions that can therefore help solve urban human problems. This classical conception of the capital and its province is the opposite of the usual planning. In terms of transportation and business, planners regard the continuous conurbation from north of Boston to Washington as one region and ask for authority to override state and municipal boundaries. For tax purposes, New York would like authority to treat the suburban counties as part of the New York region. These things are, I think, necessary, but their effect must certainly be to increase the monstrous conurbation and make it even more homogeneous. 3. The chief use of small farming at present cannot be for cash, but for its independence, simplicity, and abundance of subsistence, and to make the countryside beautiful. Rural reconstruction must mainly depend on other sources of income, providing urban social services, and, as is common, part-time factory work. Nevertheless, we ought carefully to re-examine the economics of agriculture, the real costs, and the quality of the product. With some crops, certainly with specialty and gourmet foods, the system of intensive cultivation and hothouses serving farmers' markets in the city and contracting with restaurants and hotels is quite efficient. It omits processing and packaging, cuts down on the cost of transportation, and is indispensable for quality. The development of technology in agriculture has no doubt been, as with technology in general, largely determined by economic policy and administration. If there were a premium on small, intensive cultivation, as in Holland, technology would develop to make it the most efficient. In our big cities, suburban development has irrevocably displaced nearby truck gardening, but perhaps in the next surrounding ring, now often devastated, small farming can revive even for cash. 4. National TV, movies, news services, etc. have offset provincial narrowness and rural idiocy, but they have also had a more serious effect of brainwashing the country than, at least, the big cities, which have more intellectual resistance. Country culture has quite vanished. Typical are the county papers, which now contain absolutely nothing but conventional gossip notes and ads. Yet every region has 17 TV channels available, of which only 3 or 4 are used by the national networks. I think, incidentally, that the Americans would be wise to have also a public national channel like CBC. Small broadcasting stations would be cheap to run if local people would provide the programs. That is, there is an available community voice if there were anything to say. The same holds for little theaters and local newspapers. Perhaps if communities got used to being participants and creators rather than spectators and consumers of canned information, entertainment, and design, they might recall what they are about. All such cultural and planning activities, including the sociology of the urban services, ought to be the concern of the land-grant college. At present in the United States, we have pathetically perverted this beautiful institution. The land-grant college for, as it was said, mechanics and agriculture, was subsidized to provide cultural leadership for its region, just as the academic university was supposed to be international and to teach humanities and humane professions. But now our land-grant and other regional universities have lost their community function and become imitations of the academic schools, usually routine and inadequate imitations, while the academic universities have alarmingly been corrupted to the interests of the nation and the national corporations. Naturally, the more its best young are trained to be personnel of the urban system, the more the country is depleted of brains and spirit. 5. The fruition of rural reconstruction would consist of two things: a strong cooperative movement and a town meeting democracy that makes sense in its own terms on big regional and national issues. A century ago, Tocqueville spoke with admiration of how the Americans formed voluntary associations to run society. They were engaged citizens. This would seem to be the natural tendency of independent spirits conscious of themselves as socially important. They can morally afford to pool their resources for their own purposes and cooperate. At present, it is dismaying to see individual farmers, almost on the margin, each buying expensive machinery to use a few days a year, and all totally unable to cooperate in processing or distribution. They are remarkably skillful men in a dozen crafts and sciences, but they are like children. They feel that they do not count for anything, and unable to cooperate with one another, they cannot compete, and they do not count for anything. Correspondingly, their political opinions, which used to be stubbornly sensible, although narrow, are frightened and parrot the national rhetoric as if they never engaged in dialogue and had no stake of their own. To sum up, in the United States, the excessive urbanization certainly cannot be thinned out in this generation, and we are certainly in for more trouble. In some urban functions, perhaps, like schooling, housing, and the care of mental disease, thinning out by even a few % would be useful, and the country could help in this way and regain some importance in the big society which is urban. Nevertheless, the chief advantage of rural reconstruction is for its own sake, as an alternative way of life. It could develop a real countervailing power because it is relatively independent. It is not like the orthodox pluralism of the sociologists that consists of differences that make no difference because the groups depend on one another so tightly that they form a consensus willy-nilly. The Scandinavian countries are a good model for us. By public policy over a century and a half, they have maintained a high rural ratio. For a century, they have supported a strong cooperative movement, and they have devised a remarkably various and thoughtful system of education. These things are not unrelated, and they have paid off in the most decent advanced society that there is, with a countervailing mixed economy, a responsible bureaucracy, and vigilant citizens.
That was the fourth of the 1966 Massey Lectures, The Moral Ambiguity of America, by Dr. Paul Goodman, author and perceptive social critic. Program organizer for the lectures is Robert McCormick. They are produced in New York by Del Mackenzie. Stay tuned for The Best of Ideas Part 2, immediately following the news. Ken Haslam speaking. This is The Best of Ideas from CBC Toronto, and I'm Ken Haslam, your host. On Part 1 tonight, the 1966 Massey Lectures. The subject, The Moral Ambiguity of America. And the CBC's guest speaker this year is Paul Goodman of New York. Dr. Goodman, author, critic, and teacher, is one of the most penetrating social critics in the United States today. He has described present-day society as purposeless, mindless, and morally insensitive. Dr. Goodman addresses these lectures particularly to the young people of Canada, the student body across the land, the social leaders and philosophers of the future. The 1966 Massey Lectures, Program 5, The Psychology of Being Powerless. Paul Goodman.
Americans, we have seen, believe that the great background conditions of modern life are beyond our power to influence. The abuse of technology is autonomous and cannot be checked. The galloping urbanization is going to gallop on. Our over-centralized administration, both of things and men, is impossibly cumbersome and costly, but we cannot cut it down to size. These are inevitable tendencies of history. More dramatic inevitabilities in the popular belief are the explosions, the scientific explosion and the population explosion. And there are more literal explosions. The dynamite accumulating in the slums of 1,000 cities, and the accumulating stockpiles of nuclear bombs in nations great and small. Our psychology, in brief, is that history is out of control. It is no longer something that we make, but something that happens to us. Politics is not prudent steering in difficult terrain, but it is, and this is the subject of current political science, how to get power and keep power, even though the sphere of effective power is extremely limited and it makes little difference who is in power. The psychology of historical powerlessness is evident in the reporting and the reading of newspapers. There is little analysis of how events are building up, but we read with excitement, spite, or fatalism, depending on our characters, the headlines of crises for which we are unprepared. Statesmen cope with emergencies, and the climate of emergency is chronic. I have been trying to show that some of these historical conditions are not inevitable at all, but are the working out of willful policies that aggrandize certain interests and exclude others, that subsidize certain styles and prohibit others. But of course, historically, if almost everybody believes the conditions are inevitable, including the policymakers who produce them, then they are inevitable. For to cope with emergencies does not mean, then, to support alternative conditions, but further to support and institutionalize the same conditions. Thus, if there are too many cars, we build new highways. If administration is too cumbersome, we build in new levels of administration. If there is a nuclear threat, we develop anti-missile missiles. If there is urban crowding and anomie, we step up urban renewal and social work. If there are ecological disasters because of imprudent use of technology, we subsidize research and development by the same scientific corporations working for the same ecologically irrelevant motives. If there is youth alienation, we extend and intensify schooling. If the nation-state is outmoded as a political form, we make ourselves into a mightier nation-state. In this self-proving round, the otherwise innocent style of input-output economics, games theory strategy, and computerized social science becomes a trap. But the style dumbly accepts the self-proving program and cannot compute what is not mentioned. Then the solutions that emerge ride even more roughshod over what has been left out. Indeed, at least in the social sciences, the more variables one can technically compute, the less likely it is that there will be prior thinking about their import, rather than interpretation of their combination. Our classic example is Herman Kahn on thermonuclear war. What is the psychology of feeling that one is powerless to alter basic conditions? What is it as a way of being in the world? Let me list half a dozen kinds of responses to being in a chronic emergency. Unfortunately, in America, they are exhibited in rather pure form. By definition, people who govern cannot forfeit the symbol that everything is under control, although they may not think so. During President Kennedy's administration, Arthur Schlesinger expressed the problem poignantly by saying, "One simply must govern." The theme of that administration was to be pragmatic. But by this, they did not mean a philosophical pragmatism, which goes toward an end in view from where one in fact is and with the means one has. They meant turning busily to each crisis as it arose, so that it was clear that one was not inactive. The criticism of Eisenhower's administration was that it was stagnant. The new slogan was, "Get America moving." This was rather pathetic. But as the crises have become deeper, the response of the present administration is not pathetic, but frankly delusional and dangerous. It is to will to be in control without adjusting to the realities. They seem to imagine that they will in fact buy up every economy, police the world, social engineer the cities, school the young. In this fantasy, they employ a rhetoric of astonishing dissociation between idea and reality, far beyond customary campaign oratory. For example, they proclaim that they are depolluting streams, but they allot no money. 40 demonstration cities are to be made livable and show the way, but the total sum available is $1.5 billion for 40 cities. The depressed area of Appalachia has been reclaimed, but the method is an old highway bill under another name. Poor people will run their own programs, but any administrator is fired if he tries to let them. They are suing for peace, but they dispatch more troops and bombers. This seems to be just lying, but to my ear it is nearer to magic thinking. The magic buoys up the self-image. The activity is either nothing at all or brute force to make the problem vanish. In between the ideality and the brutality, there occurs a lot of obsessional warding off of confusion by methodical calculations that solve problems in the abstract and high modern style. A precise decimal is set beyond which the economy will be inflationary, but nobody pays any mind to it. We know at what average annual income, how many peoples cause what percentage of world disturbances. A precise kill ratio is established beyond which the Viet Cong will fold up, but they don't. Polls are consulted for the consensus like the liver of sheep, without noticing signs of unrest, and even though the administration keeps committing itself to an irreversible course that allows for no choice anyway. And they are everlastingly righteous. I do not think the slogan, "The Great Society," is cynical. It is delusional. Perhaps the epitome of will operating in panic, like a case from a textbook in abnormal psychology, has been the government's handling of the assassination of John Kennedy. The Warren Commission attempted to close the case, to make it not exist in the public mind. Thus, it hastily drew firm conclusions from dubious evidence, disregarded counter-evidence, defied physical probabilities, and even, it seems clear, accepted manufactured evidence. For a temporary lull, it has run the risk of a total collapse of public trust that may end up in a Dreyfus case. Common people who do not have to govern can let themselves feel powerless and resign themselves. They respond with the familiar combination of not caring and, as a substitute, identifying with those whom they fancy to be powerful. The poor simply stop trying, become dependent, drop out of school, drop out of sight, become addicts, become lawless. It seems to be a matter of temperature or a small incident whether or not they riot. In anomic circumstances, it is hard to tell when riot or other lawlessness is a political act toward a new setup and when it is a social pathology. Being powerless as citizens, poor people have little meaningful structure in which to express or even know what they are after. The concrete objects of their anger make no political sense. They're angry at themselves or their own neighborhoods, at white people passing by, at Jewish landlords and shopkeepers. More symbolic scapegoats, like either the capitalist system or communism, do not evoke much interest. One has to feel part of a system to share its boogeymen or have a counter-ideology, and by and large, the present-day poor are not so much exploited as excluded. But to fill the void, they admire and identify with what is strong and successful, even if, perhaps especially if, it is strong and successful at their own expense. Poor Spanish youth are enthusiastic about our mighty bombs and bombers, though of course they have no interest in the foreign policy that uses them. Readers of the Daily News are excited by the dramatic confrontation of statesmen wagging fingers at each other. Negroes in Harlem admire the Cadillacs of their own corrupt politicians and racketeers. Currently, there is excitement about the words black power. In the South, where there is little Negro anomie, black power has considerable political meaning. In the northern cities, it is a frantic abstraction. Similarly, the contrary word integration makes economic and pedagogic sense if interpreted by people who have some feeling of freedom and power. But if interpreted by anomie, it turns into a fight for petty victories or spite. The anomie of middle-class people, on the other hand, appears rather as their privatism. They retreat to their families and consumer goods where they still have some power and choice. It is always necessary to explain to non-Americans that middle-class Americans are not so foolish and piggish about their standard of living as it seems. It is that the standard of living has to provide all the achievement and value that are open to them. But it is a strange thing for a society to be proud of its standard of living, rather than taking it for granted as a background for worthwhile action. Privacy is purchased at a terrible price of anxiety, excluding, and pettiness, the need to delete anything different from oneself, and to protect things that are not worth protecting. In my opinion, middle-class squeamishness and anxiety, a kind of obsessional neurosis, are a much more important cause of segregation than classical race prejudice, which is a kind of paranoia that shows up most among failing classes, bankrupt small property owners, proletarians under competitive pressure. The squeamishness is worse, for it takes people out of humanity, whereas prejudice is at least passionate. Squeamishness finally undercuts even the fairness and decency that we expect from the middle class. The identification with power of the powerless middle class is also characteristic. They do not identify with brutality, big men, or wealth, but with the efficient system itself, which is what renders them powerless. And here again, we can see the sharp polarity between those who are not politically resigned and those who are. Take the different effects of what is called education. On the one hand, the universities are the nucleus of opposition to our war policy. On the other hand, in general polls, there is always a dismaying correlation between years of schooling and the hard line of bombing China during the Korean War or bombing Hanoi now. But this is not because the educated middle class is rabidly anti-communist, and certainly it is not ferocious. Rather, it is precisely because it is rational. It approves the technically efficient solution that does not notice flesh and blood suffering. No doubt these middle-class people are influenced by the magazines they read, which explain what is efficient, but they are influenced because they are thinking types, for whom reality is what they read. The bathos of the irresponsible middle class is the nightly TV newscast on our national networks. This combines commercials for the high standard of living, scenes of war and riot, and judicious pro and con commentary on what it all means. The scenes arouse feeling, the commentary provokes thought, the commercials lead to action. It is a total experience. Let me illustrate the anomic psychology with another example, for it has come to be accepted as the normal state of feeling rather than as pathological. I apologize to the Canadian audience for choosing my example again from the Vietnam War, but my country is bombing and burning those people, and my friends and I are unable to prevent it. During the hearings on Vietnam before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Dodd of Connecticut, who had perhaps been Lyndon Johnson's favorite choice for vice president in 1964, was asked what he thought of the sharp criticism of the government. "It is the price that we pay," he said, "for living in a free country." What an astonishing evaluation of the democratic process it is, that free discussion is a weakness we must put up with in order to avoid the evils of another system. To Milton, Spinoza, or Jefferson, free discussion was the strength of a society. Their theory was that truth had power, often weak at first, but steady and cumulative, and in free debate the right course would emerge and prevail. Thus, to arrive at wise policy, it was essential for everybody to say his say, and the more disparate the views and searching the criticism, the better. Senator Dodd seems to have the following epistemology of democracy. We elect an administration, and it, through the intelligence service, secret diplomacy, briefings by the Department of Defense and other agencies, comes into inside information that enables it alone to understand the situation. In principle, we can repudiate its decisions at the next election, but usually they have led to commitments and actions that are hard to repudiate. Implicit is that there is a permanent group of selfless and wise public servants, experts and impartial reporters, who understand the technology, strategy, and diplomacy that we cannot understand, and therefore we must perforce do what they advise. To be sure, this permanent group continually makes bad predictions, And on the evidence, they are partial or at least narrow in their commercial interests and political outlook. Yet this does not alter the picture. For if the president goes along with them, outside criticism is irrelevant anyway, and no doubt misses the point, which, it happens, cannot be disclosed for reasons of national security. And surely irrelevant discussion is harmful because it is divisive, but it is the price we pay for living in a free country. What can be the attraction of such a deluded faith in democracy? It is what is appropriate in a chronic, low-grade emergency. In an emergency, it is rational and indeed natural to concentrate temporary power in a small center, as the ancient Romans appointed dictators to decide and act, and for the rest of us to support the fait accompli for better or worse. But since we face a low-grade emergency, nobody is about to invade San Francisco, we like to go on as usual, including sounding off and criticizing, so long as it does not affect policy. Unfortunately, this psychology keeps the low-grade emergency chronic. There is no way to get back to normal till so much damage has been done that there is a public revulsion, as after a few years of Korea, or, as seems inevitable, one day a catastrophe. Worst of all, there is no way for a philosophic view to emerge that might become effectual. Who would present such a view? In the classical theory of democracy, the electorate is educated by the clashing debate, and the best men come forward and gain a following. But in Senator Dodd's free country, acute men are likely to fall silent, for what is the use of talk that is irrelevant and divisive? The discussion in the Foreign Relations Committee, excellent as it was itself typical of a timid democracy. Not a single senator was able to insist on basic realities that could put the Vietnam War in a philosophic light and perhaps work out of its dilemmas. Since then, by the way, Senator Fulbright has become more outspoken. In this context, these are some of the basic realities. In a period of worldwide communications and spread of technology, and therefore of rising aspirations, nevertheless, the majority of mankind is fast becoming poorer. For our own country, is it really in our national interest to come on as a great power, touchy about saving face and telling other peoples how to act or else? In the era of one world and the atom bomb, is there not something baroque in the sovereignty of nation-states and legalisms about who aggressed on whom? It will be objected that such anti-national issues can hardly be raised by senators, even in a free debate. But the same limitation exists outside of government. In the scores of pretentious TV debates and panel discussions on Vietnam during the past 2 years, I doubt that there have been a half a dozen, and these not on national networks, in which a speaker was invited who might conceivably go outside the official parameters and raise the real questions. Almost always the extreme opposition is himself a proponent of power politics, like Hans Morgenthau. It usually is Hans Morgenthau. Why not A.J. Muste, for instance? Naturally, the big networks would say that there is no use in presenting quixotic opinions that are irrelevant. The word quixotic was used by General Sarnoff of the National Broadcasting Company in his successful bid to Congress to deny to third-party candidates equal free time. By this response, the broadcasters guarantee that the opinions will remain irrelevant until history, out of control, makes them relevant because they happen to have been true. This brings me back to my subject, how people are in the world when history is out of control. So far, I have noticed those who unhistorically will to be in control, and those who accept their powerlessness and withdraw. But there is another possibility, apocalypse. Not only to accept being powerless, but to expect, or perhaps wish and hasten, the inevitable historical explosion. Again, there are two variants, for it is usually a different psychology entailing different behavior to expect a catastrophe and beat around for what to do for oneself, or to wish for the catastrophe and identify with it. To expect disaster and desert the sinking ship is not a political act, but it is often a profoundly creative one, both personally and socially. To do it, one must have vitality of one's own that is not entirely structured and warped by the suicidal system. And going it alone may allow for new development. For instance, when the youth of the Beat movement cut loose from the organized system, opted for voluntary poverty, and invented a morals and culture out of their own guts and some confused literary memories, they exerted a big and, on the whole, good influence. Also, the disposition of the powers that be to treat gross realities as irrelevant has driven many intellectual and spirited persons into deviant paths just to make sense of their own experience. Thus, at present, perhaps most of the best artists and writers in America are unusually far out of line, even for creative people. They hardly seem to share the common culture, yet they are what culture we have. We must remember that with the atom bombs, there is a literal meaning to deserting the ship. This factor is always present in the background of the young. For instance, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I kept getting phone calls from college students asking if they should at once fly to New Zealand. I tried to calm their anxiety by opining that the crisis was only diplomatic maneuvering, but I now think that I was wrong. For eyewitnesses of behavior in Washington at the time tell me that there was a danger of nuclear war. More generally, the psychology of apocalypse and the decision to go it alone are characteristic of waves of populism, such as we are now surprisingly witnessing in the United States. The rhetoric of the agrarian populism of the 80s and 90s was vividly apocalyptic, and that movement brought forth remarkable feats of cooperation and social invention. The current urban and student populism, as I have pointed out in these lectures, has begun to produce its own para-institutional enterprises. The practice of civil disobedience also must often be interpreted in terms of the psychology of apocalypse. But even sympathetic legal analysts of civil disobedience fail to take this into account. It is one thing to disobey a law because the authorities are in moral error on some point, in order to force a test case and to rally opposition and change the law. It is another thing to disobey authorities who are the whore of Babylon and the devil's thrones and dominions. In such a case, the conscientious attitude may be not respect, but disregard and disgust, and it may be more moral for God's creatures to go underground rather than to confront, especially if their theology does not include an article on paradise for martyrs. As a citizen of the uncorrupted polity in exile, it might be one's civil duty to be apparently lawless. There is a fairly clear-cut distinction between civil disobedience in a legitimate order and revolution that may or may not prove its own legitimacy. But the politics and morality of apocalypse fall in between and are ambiguous. Quite different, finally, is the psychology of those who unconsciously or consciously wish for catastrophe and work to bring it about. Of course, for the best youth to desert the sinking ship also brings about disaster by default. The wish for a blow-up occurs in people who are so enmeshed in a frustrating system that they have no vitality apart from it, and their vitality in it is explosive rage. Very poor people who have the culture of poverty, as Oscar Lewis calls it, are rarely so psychologically committed to a dominant social system that they need its total destruction. They have dreams of heaven, but not of hellfire. A few exemplary burnings and beheadings mollify their vengeance. Their intellectual leaders, however, who are verbal and willy-nilly psychologically enmeshed in the hated system, might be more apocalyptic. For instance, Malcolm X once told me, it was before his last period, which was more rational and political, that he would welcome the atom bombing of New York to vindicate Allah, even though it destroyed his own community. James Baldwin is full of hellfire, but I have never heard much of it in popular religion. On the whole, at present, in the United States, the psychology of explosive apocalypse is not to be found among rioting Negroes crying, "Burn, baby, burn," nor among utopian beatniks on hallucinogens. It is to be found among people who believe in the system, but cannot tolerate the anxiety of its not working out for them. Unfortunately, it is a pretty empty system, and anxiety is widespread. Most obviously, there is the large group of people who have been demoted or are threatened with demotion. Businessmen and small property owners who feel they have been pushed around. Victims of inflation, displaced farmers, dissatisfied ex-soldiers, proletarians who have become petty bourgeois but are now threatened by automation or by Negroes invading their neighborhoods. Consciously, these people do not want to blow up, but power to restore the good old days. But when they keep losing out, they manifest in astounding violence and vigilantism, and could become the usual mass base for fascism. In foreign policy, where imagination has freer reign, they are for preemptive first strikes, bombing China, and so forth. I do not think this group is dangerous in itself. I do not think there is an important radical right in the United States, but it is a sounding board to propagate catastrophic ideas to more important groups. My guess is that under our bad urban conditions, a more dangerous group is the uncountable number of the mentally ill and psychopathic hoodlums from all kinds of backgrounds. Given the rate of mental disease and the arming and training and violence of hundreds of thousands of young men, there is sure to be an increase of berserk acts that might sometimes amount to a reign of terror and could create a climate for political enormities, not to speak of organized stormtrooping. The most dangerous group of all, however, is the established but anomic middle class that I described previously. Exclusive, conformist, squeamish, and methodical, it is terribly vulnerable to anxiety. When none of its rational solutions work out, at home or abroad, its patience will wear thin, and then it could coldly support a policy of doom just to have the problems over with, the way a man counts to 3 and blows his brains out. But this cold, conscious acceptance would not be possible if unconsciously there were not a lust for destruction of the constraining system, as sober citizens excitedly watch a house burn down. The conditions of middle-class life are exquisitely calculated to increase tension and heighten anxiety. It is not so much that the pace is fast. Often it consists of waiting around and is slow and boring, but that it is somebody else's pace or schedule. One is continually interrupted, and the tension cannot be normally discharged by decisive action and doing things one's own way. There is a competitive pressure to act a role, yet paradoxically, one is rarely allowed to do one's best or use one's best judgment. Proofs of success or failure are not tangibly given in the task, but always in some superior's judgment. Spontaneity and instinct are likely to be gravely penalized, yet one is supposed to be creative and sexual on demand. All this is what Freud calls civilization and its discontents. Wilhelm Reich showed that this kind of anxiety led to dreams of destruction, self-destruction, and explosion in order to release tension, feel something, and feel free. A chronic low-grade emergency is not psychologically static. It builds up to and invites a critical emergency. But just as we are able to overlook glaring economic and ecological realities, so in our social engineering and system of education, glaring psychological realities like anomie and anxiety are regarded almost as if they did not exist. The psychological climate explains, I think, the peculiar attitude of the Americans toward the escalation of the Vietnam War. At the time I'm writing this, more bombs are being rained on that little country than on Germany at the peak of World War II. And there was talk of sending nearly 1 million men. The government's statements of purpose are inconsistent week by week and are belied by its actions. Its predictions are ludicrously falsified by what happens. Field commanders lie and are contradicted by the next day's news. Yet a good majority continues to acquiesce with a paralyzed fascination. This paralysis is not indifference, for finally people talk about nothing else, as I in these lectures. One has the impression that it is an exciting attraction of a policy, that it is doomed.
The Psychology of Being Powerless, the 5th talk of the 6 Massey Lectures for 1966 by Dr. Paul Goodman. The series was organized in Toronto by Robert McCormick and produced in New York City by Del McKenzie. And that's The Best of Ideas, Part 1. Program organizer is Phyllis Webb, with production by Janet Somerville. This is Ken Haslam speaking. This is The Best of Ideas, Part 1 from CBC Toronto. I'm your host, Ken Haslam. Tonight, the 1966 Massey Lectures by Dr. Paul Goodman. Penetrating social critic and lecturer, Paul Goodman is also the author of some of this century's most effective works of social philosophy. Growing Up Absurd, People or Personnel, compulsory miseducation, and others. First heard on the CBC FM network series, Ideas, the Moral Ambiguity of America lectures are addressed particularly to the young people of Canada, the social leaders of the future. Paul Goodman concludes tonight with the sixth lecture he calls, Is American Democracy Viable?
I have been giving you a gloomy picture of my country. Our policies range from dishonest to delusional. Our system of interlocking institutions finally mechanically goes its own way and runs over human beings. Our people have become stupid and uncitizenly and are lusting for an explosion. Nevertheless, let me praise us for a moment. We are headed for trouble, but we have moral strengths. We have a healthy good humor that is neither cynical nor resigned. We are seasoned. We got there first. In the high technology, high standard of living, and other conditions of modern times. I think we have fewer illusions about them than other advanced peoples. We are not so foolish and piggish about them as we seem. Morally, despite what seems, Americans are classless and democratic and cannot think in other terms. And if a case really comes to public notice, we will not tolerate an individual's being pushed around, though it certainly takes a lot to get some cases to public notice. We are not cowed by authority, and we are energetic and experimental, though not very intelligent about it. But perhaps our greatest strength is an historical one. Quixotic as it seems, we have an abiding loyalty to the spirit, and sometimes, unfortunately, the letter, of the American political system. Unlike in many countries, our extreme groups, birch-eyed students of the New Left, Negroes who want black power, are sincerely loyal to this history and spirit, more loyal indeed than the center is, which is lulled by its self-satisfied belief in social engineering. In a crisis, the great majority will continue to be historically loyal, and we will not have fascism or 1984, though we may well have disaster. Thus, to repeat what I said at the beginning of this series of lectures, the question is whether our beautiful libertarian, pluralist, and populist experiment is indeed viable in modern conditions. We can make it so, both institutionally and because we have the will. The present trends are not inevitable. However, I am not sure that we will make it so, because of pressure of time and panicking. In the American tradition, constitution makers have been lawyers, and since we have so many new conditions, it is the task of young lawyers to come up with constitutional innovations to keep the American polity alive. Just consider some of our unique domestic problems, passing by the whole field of world law that must be developed almost from scratch. When the media of mass communications require immense capital, or like the broadcasting channels, are scarce and licensed, how to safeguard against de facto censorship and the brainwashing that is now evident? When mass compulsory education stretches for longer years, how to give rights to the young so that they are not regimented like conscripts and processed like things? When nearly half the young adults are obliged to go to college, what are their social, political, and academic rights? What do Lehrfreiheit and Lernfreiheit now mean? In a hardening Mandarin establishment of mutually accrediting universities, state boards, and corporate employers, how to change the licensing of professionals and indeed of ordinary employment so that competent people are not stymied because they do not have irrelevant diplomas. When corporations have grown to the size of feudal baronies and the lines of communication within them become tenuous, the traditional concepts of responsibility of principal and agent are inadequate. How to protect subordinates as moral beings? What are their rights in the decisions they must execute? As technologies expand and their remote effects cannot be avoided by anybody, how to give citizens an effective voice in the shape of the environment, not to speak of a remedy against abuses? As the technical and staff power of the police and other bureaucracies increases, how to bolster the resources of citizens so that we have a fair contest in court or in agency? As the complexity, delays, and distance of ordinary political process become greater, while often the tension of problems becomes worse, it is inevitable that spirited people will resort to various degrees of protest and civil disobedience. How to encourage this rather than render it destructive by disregarding the need for it, or even exacting draconian penalties to stamp it out. Finally, in a national corporate economy, most taxes must be channeled through the national government, yet municipal and community functions must still be locally controlled in order to be humanly relevant. Then how to organize jurisdiction and budgeting so that people do not dodge their community responsibilities, and yet central authorities do not take over. Here, I said, are some of the crashingly important legal problems that must be solved in order to make American democracy work. We have a school of sociology in the United States, that is the liberal orthodoxy, that holds that democratic rights are effectively secured by our present pluralism of institutions and interest groups: labor, capital, the professions, the universities, religious sects, ethnic groups, sectional interests, government, and the general public. According to theory, these groups struggle for advantage and countervail one another, and through them, each man can exert influence. Admittedly, the institutions and interest groups are centralized and bureaucratized, but this is an advantage, not a disadvantage, according to this theory. For an individual can compete to rise in his own interest group, and the decision-makers of the various bureaucracies, each backed by massive power, can treat with one another in a rational way according to the rules of the game, for example, by collective bargaining, and so avoid unseemly strikes, cutthroat competition, riot, and other disorder. This, in turn, makes possible a general harmony and diminishes everybody's anxiety. It is a sociologist's dream. I am afraid that there is nothing in this theory. For the genius of our centralized bureaucracies has been, as they interlock, to form a mutually accrediting establishment of decision-makers with common interests and a common style that nullify the diversity of pluralism. Conflict becomes coalition, harmony becomes consensus, and the social machine runs with no check at all. For instance, our regulatory agencies are wonderfully in agreement with the corporations they regulate. It is almost unheard of for the universities or scientists to say veto, whether to the pesticides or the causes of smog, the TV programming, the military strategy, or the moonshot. An exception was the fallout from the bomb testing, by the way. It seems to me impossible that there should be so much happiness. There is a metaphysical defect in our pluralism. The competing groups are all after the same values, the same money, the same standard of living and fringe benefits. There can then be fierce competition between groups for a bigger cut in the budget, but there is no moral or constitutional countervalence of interests. Let me put this another way. The bother with the profit system has turned out to be not, as the socialists predicted, that it doesn't work, but that it works splendidly. And so long as a person's activity pays off in the common coin, he doesn't much care about his special vocation, his profession, his functional independence, way of life, his way of being in the community, or his corporate responsibility for public good. For a pluralism to work democratically, like a guild socialism, a syndicalist system, or a medieval commune, it must proceed in just the opposite direction than that envisaged by our orthodox sociologists. It must try to increase class consciousness, craft pride, professional autonomy, faculty power in the universities, cooperative enterprise, local patriotism, and rural reconstruction. When members of a group stubbornly stand for something, the association will throw its weight around in the community. When the association insists on its special role in the community, that must be accommodated to in its own terms, though not, of course, on its own terms. The members will be active in the association. What would such a medieval pluralism entail? In the first place, there would be conflict and not harmony. At present, labor and capital can come to an agreement on wages, hours, and benefits and pass on the costs. But the situation is much more electric if workmen ask, as they should, for a say in the work process and the quality and utility of the product on which they spend their lives. In an authentic pluralism, a teachers' union will want to determine curriculum, method, and class size in the public schools. But neither the administrators, the mayor, nor the parents will agree to this. If the medical association comes on as a professional group, it will support rather than oppose community payment of fees, which is good for the health of the poor, but it will also intervene on slum conditions and the narcotics laws. The radio and television people will want some control over how they are edited and programmed. We are currently witnessing the conflicts that arise when ethnic groups are organized in their neighborhoods in an authentically pluralist fashion. Next, let us look at the other side of the medal, the specific community responsibility of corporate groups which they now disregard. At present, we make a thing of corporations policing themselves, probably wisely since external regulation does not work anyway. But of course, this can help only to prevent abuses, not to guarantee positive performance. Also, if the spirit is lacking, the flesh tends to default. To give a ludicrous example, when our Congress passed a law requiring fair TV coverage on both sides of controversial questions, the broadcasters responded simply by cutting back on controversial programs altogether. But consider the following as a better model. Since our vastly expanding armaments industries create in whole sections and in millions of workmen a vested economic interest in war, a bill was introduced in Congress, I think by Kastenmeier of Wisconsin, to require armaments manufacturers to prepare plans for alternative peaceful use of the expanded plant as a condition for getting an armaments contract. On this model, I have suggested a proposal that might be applicable in Canada to countervail the brainwashing inevitable with the vast audiences of mass media controlled by a few centers. Impose a small progressive tax on audience size, a tax for revenue, not to prohibit, to underwrite independent media with rival views. By the same reasoning, corporations that greatly improve their position by technological advances, for example automation, have a responsibility to provide relevant education of the young, whose entry into society is made more difficult. At present, of course, these corporations do just the opposite. They urge the public and parents to spend money to train A-plus algebrists whom they will use after national examinations have weeded out the B's and C's. The advantage of proposals like these is that they constitutionally guarantee countervalence. Whenever a group begins to have a great influence, the danger generates its own antidote, without punitive machinery which has no positive result, and without adding new levels of regulation and administration. A major means of creating an effective pluralism is decentralization, to increase the amount of mind and the number of wills initiating and deciding. Very many functions of modern society must, of course, be centralized, and in my opinion, there are many other functions which should be more centralized than they now are. I have discussed this question in a book called People or Personnel. On a whole, however, we would be wise at present to decentralize wherever it is feasible without too great loss of efficiency. Indeed, in a wide range of enterprises, decentralization means a gain in efficiency. The current style is the opposite. Big corporations invade new fields in which they have no competence just to get contracts, and they will not easily be persuaded to change. Yet a lot could be done by public policy. For example, to give out public money preferably to small independent firms in research and development, urban planning and renewal, and communications. At present, farm subsidies favor big plantations and chain grocers. They could often as well or better favor small farmers and cooperatives. In schooling, a case can be made for the consolidation of rural schools, but there is no doubt that urban systems should be radically decentralized. Many giant universities would have more vitality and be cheaper to run if they were allowed to fall apart into their natural faculties and schools. It is indispensable for social work to be administered locally and democratically in order to combat anomie. Neighborhood treatment of mental disease seems to make sense in most cases. The experience of the Peckham Health Centre in London suggests that it is better for many other parts of medicine. And, as I argued in a previous lecture, many urban problems that are prohibitively expensive and intractable in the city could be better handled in the depopulating countryside and be a grounds for rural reconstruction. A chief reason to encourage decentralism is just to have a countervailing style of enterprise, one that does not require big capital, grandiose overhead, and all kinds of connections and credentials. The liberal sociologists of pluralism don't understand the matter of style at all, but many conservatives understand it very well. and therefore have much in common with the new radicals. The older planning radicalism of the 30s, however, played right into the present liberal social engineering. To conclude this series of lectures on the crisis of the American political experiment, populist, pluralist, libertarian, let me say something about our peculiar American libertarianism, which is, I guess, along with our energy and enterprise, what most impresses Europeans about us. As a theme of history, the American kind of freedom has been traced to many things. The Americans were Englishmen, they were yeomen, they were Protestant refugees, they were other refugees, they had an open frontier. All these are relevant, but I am struck also by a constitutional aspect which I like perhaps to exaggerate. Of all politically advanced peoples, the Americans are the only ones who started in an historical golden age of anarchy. Having gotten rid of the king, and he was always far away as well as being only an English king, they were in no hurry to reconstruct another sovereign, or even a concept of sovereignty. For more than 30 years after the outbreak of the revolution, almost nobody bothered to vote in formal elections, often less than 2%. And the national constitution was the concern of a few merchants and lawyers. Yet the Americans were not a primitive or unpolitical people. On the contrary, they had many kinds of civilized, democratic and hierarchical structures: town meetings, congregational parishes, masters with apprentices and indentured servants, gentry with slaves, professionals and clients, provincial assemblies. The pluralism goes way back, but where was the sovereignty? Theoretically, the sovereignty resided in the people. But except for the sporadic waves of protest like the riots, the Tea Parties, and the Revolutionary War itself, the populism also goes way back. Who were the people? One does not at all have the impression, in this congeries of families, face-to-face communities, and pluralist social relations, that there was anything like a general will, except maybe to be let alone. Nevertheless, there is, it is clear from American behavior, a characteristic kind of sovereignty. It is what is made up by political people as they go along, a continuous series of existential constitutional acts, just as they invented the Declaration, the Articles, and the Constitution, and obviously expected to keep rewriting the Constitution. The Founding Fathers were saddled with a Roman language, and so they spoke of inalienable rights. But the American theory is idiomatically expressed by pragmatists like William James. I have certain rights and will act accordingly, including finally punching you in the nose if you don't concede them. In the context of this pragmatic American attitude towards sovereignty, what is the meaning of the present wave of civil disobedience? Against direct actions like the civil rights sit-ins, the student occupation of Sproul Hall at Berkeley, the draft card burnings, it is always said that they foment disrespect for law and order and lead to a general breakdown of civil society. Although judicious people are willing to grant that due process and ordinary administration are not working well because of prejudice, unconcern, double talk, arrogance, or perhaps just the cumbersomeness of over-centralized bureaucracy, nevertheless, they say, the recourse to civil disobedience entails worse evils. This is an apparently powerful argument. Even those who engage in civil disobedience tend to concede it, but they say, in a crisis they cannot act otherwise. They are swept by indignation, or they are morally compelled to resist evil. Or, as I mentioned in my last lecture, they have an apocalyptic theory in which they are acting for a higher justice, and the present order is no longer legitimate. In my opinion, all these views are exaggerations, because they assign a status and finality to the sovereign, which in America it does not have. If the state is not quite so determinate, then the insult to it does not necessarily have such global consequences. Certainly the American genius, whether we cite Jefferson or James and Dewey more than a century later, is that the state is in process, in a kind of regulated permanent revolution. Empirically, is it the case that direct actions which are aimed at specific abuses lead to general lawlessness? Where is the evidence to prove the connection? For example, statistics of correlative disorder in the community, or an increase of unspecific lawless acts among the direct activists themselves. The flimsy evidence that there is tends to weigh in the opposite direction. Crime and delinquency diminish where there has been direct political action by Negroes. The community and academic spirit at Berkeley has been better this year than it used to be. In 1944, the warden of Danbury Prison assured me that the war objectives penned up there were, in general, in his words, the finest type of citizens. On sociological grounds, indeed, the probability is that a specific direct action that cuts through frustrating due process, and especially if it is successful or partially successful, will tend to increase civil order rather than to destroy it. The enforcement of law and order at all costs aggravates the tensions that lead to explosions. But if place is allowed for creative disorder, as Arthur Waskow calls it, there is less tension, less resignation, and more likelihood of finding social, economic, and political expedients to continue with. Of course, this raises a nice legal question: how to distinguish between a rioting mob and citizens engaging in creative disorder. Theoretically, it is a rioting mob, according to the wisdom of Le Bon and Freud, if it is in the grip of unconscious ideas of father or the need to destroy father, if it is after senseless power or to destroy senseless power. But it is a group of confused Americans if it is demanding to be paid attention to and included as the first step of political thinking. Perhaps it is petitioning for a redress of grievances, even if it has no writ of grievances to present, and even if there is no sovereign to petition. But in either case, the part of wisdom is to take people seriously and come up with a new idea that might make a difference to their problems. If the governors won't or can't do this, then we must do it. I am often asked by radical students what I am trying to do with all my utopian thinking and inventing of alternatives. Perhaps the use of intellect is to help turn riot into creative disorder. In brief, contrary to the conventional argument, anarchic incidents like civil disobedience are often essential parts of the democratic process as Americans understand it. It has been recently understood by the pragmatic Supreme Court, where many cases of apparently obvious trespass and violation have turned out to be legal after all, and only subsequently made legal by statute. This is not, I believe, because the court has been terrorized or has blinked in order to avoid worse evils, but because in rapidly changing circumstances, there is often no other way to know what the Constitution is. Finally, I need hardly point out that in American rhetoric, American freedom, in an anarchic sense, has been held to be the philosopher's stone of our famous energy and enterprise. Mossback conservatives have always spoken for laissez-faire as the right climate for economic progress, though to be sure they then connive for tariffs and subsidies, hire strikebreakers, and form monopolies in restraint of trade. Radical liberals have cleaved to the Bill of Rights, for to be cowed by authority makes it impossible to think and experiment. Immigrants used to flock to the United States to avoid conscription, and because there were no class barriers here, and because there was open opportunity to make good in one's own way. And every American kid soon learns to say, "It's a free country, you can't make me." By and large, let me say, this rhetoric has been true. Anarchism is grounded in a rather definite social psychological hypothesis that forceful, graceful, and intelligent behavior occurs only when there is an uncoerced and direct response to the environment. That in most human affairs, more harm than good results from compulsion, top-down direction, bureaucratic planning, preordained curricula, jails, conscription, states. Sometimes it is necessary to limit freedom, as we keep a child from running across the highway, but this is usually at the expense of force, grace, and learning, and in the long run it is usually wiser to remove the danger and simplify the rules than to hamper the activity. I think I say that this hypothesis is true, but whether or not it is, it would certainly be un-American to deny it. Everybody knows that America is great because America is free. And by freedom is not finally meant the juridical freedom of the European tradition, freedom under law, having the legal rights and duties of citizens, What is meant is the spontaneous freedom of anarchy, opportunity to do what you can, although hampered by necessary conventions, as few as possible. Then, how profoundly alien our present establishment is, that has in one generation crept up on us and occupied all the positions of power. It has been largely the product of war, of the dislocations after World War I, the crash programs of World War II, and going on for 20 years, the chronic low-grade emergency of the Cold War. It is fanning again into war. The term establishment itself is borrowed from the British for snobbish and literary reasons, and usually with an edge of satire. But we have had no sovereign to establish such a thing, and there is no public psychology to accept it as legitimate. It operates like an establishment. It is the consensus of politics, the universities and science, big business, organized labor, public schooling, the media of communications, the official language. It determines the right style and accredits its own members. It hires and excludes, subsidizes and neglects. But it has no warrant of legitimacy. It has no tradition. It cannot talk straight English. It neither has produced nor could produce any art. It does not lead by moral means, but by a kind of social engineering. And it is held in contempt and detestation by the young. The American tradition, I think the abiding American tradition, is pluralist, populist, and libertarian, while the establishment is monolithic, mandarin, and managed. And its only claim that it is efficient is false. It is fantastically wasteful of brains, money, and the environment and people. It is channeling our energy and enterprise to its own aggrandizement and power, and it will exhaust us. Let me assess our situation as soberly as I can. The system at present dominant in America will not do. It is too empty. On the other hand, it is possible that classical American democracy is necessarily a thing of the past. It may be too wild, too woolly, too mixed, too anarchic, too populist, too pluralist, for the conditions of big population and high technology in a world that has become small. I hope not, for I love the American experiment, but I don't know. We Americans have not suffered as most other peoples have, at least not since the Civil War a century ago. We have not been bombed. We have not been occupied. We have not cringed under a real tyranny. Perhaps we would not ride so high today if we knew what it felt like to be badly hurt. The American faces that used to be so beautiful, so resolute, and yet poignantly open and innocent, are looking ugly these days, hard, thin-lipped, and like innocence spoilt without having become experienced. For our sake as well as your own, be wary of us.
Dr. Paul Goodman, American social critic, author, and lecturer, with his sixth and last Massey Lecture for 1966. The CBC will publish the lectures, The Moral Ambiguity of America, in paperback form. To reserve your copy, send a check or money order for $1.25, payable to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, to CBC Publications, Box 500, Terminal A, Toronto. The 1966 Massey Lectures were organized in Toronto by Robert McCormick and were produced in New York by Del Mackenzie. And that's The Best of Ideas, Part 1, produced in Toronto by Janet Somerville. Ken Haslam speaking.